Hello, and welcome to the CSJ's Beyond Westminster podcast, where we bring you real stories from across Britain's forgotten communities. Today's episode is the second segment in our two-part series on criminal exploitation. We'll be led by Louise Gleisch, our own senior researcher for the CSJ's Joint Modern Slavery Policy Unit with Justice and Care, as we explore the profound effects of criminal exploitation on victims of modern slavery. We'll share firsthand insights from experts and those directly affected by this issue, and discuss our latest report, Criminal Exploitation, Modern Slavery by Another Name, which sets out the critical measures government needs to take to tackle this pernicious crime. Our guests include Eleanor Lyons, the Independent Anti-Slavery Commissioner, Sir Ian Duncan Smith, Conservative MP for Chingford and Woodford Green and Chairman of the Centre for Social Justice, Colin Ward, a former police officer, Amanda Radley, child exploitation expert at the British Transport Police, and Joella Smith, the Assistant Director of Services at Action Homeless Leicester. Before we dive into today's episode, we want to emphasize that the topic of criminal exploitation is deeply troubling and contains discussions of abuse, violence, and exploitation of children and vulnerable adults. While we aim to shed light on this critical issue and discuss how to combat it, we understand that some listeners may find this content distressing, and as such, listener discretion is advised. So, on today's important episode, we invite you to go beyond the sensational headlines, beyond the surface of the stories, and beyond Westminster.
In an earlier podcast, Betraying Our Children, we looked at child criminal exploitation. As we explored then, criminal exploitation is when someone is coerced or groomed into committing crime for the benefit of another person. Our recent report, in collaboration with Justice and Care, shows that it can affect both adults and children. And while it is often connected with county lines drug dealing, it can involve other types of criminal activity too. Criminal exploitation is the most prevalent type of modern slavery reported by potential victims exploited in the UK. Most of them are British victims and young people aged under 18. We also found that financial deprivation and vulnerability factors like family breakdown, school exclusion, learning disability, or substance misuse put people at greater risk. We spoke to our guests today about what they see in their communities.
In British Transport Police, we will be coming across a range of forms of criminal exploitation. My role is within the County Lines Task Force. So in terms of what we see around the county lines picture is children and adults, vulnerable adults being trafficked across the country, sometimes long distances, sometimes shorter, utilising the trains to get from place to place, and they potentially be carrying drugs, money, or sometimes weapons that will be facilitating that form of exploitation. And those people can obviously be quite vulnerable, although may not appear so. Also, the use of social media, I guess, again, is probably something we're in policing still trying to grapple with, but we know that obviously is quite advanced and is potentially harder to detect and see what potentially has happened, because obviously messages, etc., can disappear a lot quicker than they can with perhaps text messages. So certainly the use of social media, and potentially then the accesses and the targeting and grooming of children and young people also wider because of the use of that methodology.
Sir Ian, what does criminal exploitation look like in your constituency?
Well, in my constituency and beyond, with many of my colleagues, it's quite clear that criminal exploitation takes place in pretty much every single area. Clearly, it's almost certainly going to be concentrated in some of the poorer communities, because that's where many of the gangs originate and that's where many of them work. But at the same time, it covers their activities, as a result, will cover into the wealthier areas, because gangs are about making money. So the two areas come together. Number one, of course, the number one driver of criminal exploitation is criminal activity itself. So we've had issues about gangs in my constituency, in our borough. We have a lot of gang warfare going on between different rival gangs, and the exploitation of this comes when they suck up the young kids, sometimes as young as 10 or 11 years old, in the area. Can be from recent arrivals, people that have come here as a result of the problems where they've lived, whether it be themselves, threats, violence, or they're just claiming asylum here. But one way or the other, it can also be kids from families that have been here for generations. What happens is they use these kids in the gangs to move cash, weapons, and drugs. And the reason they use young kids to do this is because basically they think they're less likely to be stopped by the police. And if they are, more difficult to prove any connection. So the police have to stop more kids to do this, to find these things that they're doing. But these kids themselves are often not there because they volunteered. They're there because what happens is one day somebody comes along and says, I need you to get this stuff from A to B for me. Here, I'll pay you, 20 quid for it. You just need to go and deliver it to a bloke at the other end. But en route to there, then what happens is they get stopped by somebody and they get robbed. And then the next time they meet the same character, he says, you owe me, the £500 that I gave you to move from A to B. And the young kid says, I haven't got it. He said, no, well, you're going to pay it back to me in kind. And the reality is then that they then get locked into the gang process for a long period of time because they can't get themselves out. And then if they do, they try and run away from it, the families get then hammered. And I've seen the results of what happens when a lone parent or whatever finds these people at her door, threatening to deal with her unless her son complies with what they're after, and it goes on. That's sort of the criminal entrapment that takes place, and then the exploitation is they then get caught up in the gangs. Once they're caught up in the gangs like that, there's probably no way out at this stage. They become themselves hardened criminals, which is a shocking outcome.
Former police officer Colin Ward told us about the range of people who can become victims of criminal exploitation.
Yeah, my experience, it can affect anybody. It's not just it's affecting the young, it's affecting the old. It can affect British, foreign nationals, anybody at all it can affect. The usual ones that people think about with criminal exploitation is a cannabis farm, someone being exploited in that. Or it might be the county lines, the drug line, where there's young people or vulnerable adults being exploited. However, in the last few years, the large growth I've seen is in people being exploited in their own houses, what we call cuckooing. The exploitation affects the victim who's been used to store those drugs or firearms, but it also affects their family, their children, their community.
Criminal exploitation has a devastating impact on victims. Some experience physical injuries, as well as trauma and mental health problems resulting from threats and violence. Missing school can be hugely damaging to young people's chances of getting the qualifications they need. And cuckooing victims may become homeless. They, even whole families, might need to relocate to avoid being exploited again. Worse still, if victims aren't identified and helped, they can be trapped in a cycle of exploitation and drawn into ever more serious criminality. We asked our experts what the biggest challenges are for tackling criminal exploitation, starting with Eleanor Lyons, the Independent Anti-Slavery Commissioner.
So I think the biggest challenge we're facing at the moment is gangs are being far more ruthless in the way they're willing to exploit people. We're seeing criminal gangs being more willing to exploit vulnerable adults and children and young people in new ways. Alongside that, I think there's a lack of awareness and understanding by police and other professionals in identifying potential victims of criminal exploitation, at the same time as focusing on going after the perpetrators and criminal gangs. I think it's also worth remembering and recognising that the largest numbers of those within the National Referral Mechanism, the framework we use to identify potential victims of modern slavery in this country, are UK nationals in the latest statistics. And that's large numbers of children and young people from across the country, but it's also adult victims too. I think we need to be far clearer with where adult victims are getting support from, whether it's from statutory services or specialised support, which is targeted at supporting them through the challenges of being a potential victim of modern slavery, just to make sure that they are not falling through the gaps and not becoming even more vulnerable. And I think those challenges of identification, the new tactics that criminal gangs are willing to do, and the large numbers of UK nationals that we are seeing being criminally exploited is creating more challenges for us to be able to provide the right support and care at the right time.
Yeah, again, in my experience, I think police are starting to understand the vulnerability in this crime, but they've still got a long way to go. The more reports, the more intelligence that comes in, the better that will become. As an ex-drug dealer once told me on a training event I was at, he said that every drug line will have a cuckoo victim there. So that is frightening to think how many vulnerable people are out there. Police forces are carrying out fantastic work to shut drug lines. However, I think this is disproportionate to the number of people being identified as being exploited in these drug lines, whether that is a person selling the drugs or is that poor person who's been exploited at the end as a cuckooed victim.
I think awareness has grown around those dilemmas in terms of the exploitation of children and vulnerable adults in terms of their involvement in criminal activity and not just seeing what's in front of you, but exploring behind in terms of what might be accounting for that. That probably is more developed in some areas than others, in my experience, depending on the nature of the teams and the experience. And there is a reality, obviously, the resources within all organisations, but within policing are challenged and compared to the demand. So it is more complex to investigate a crime of modern slavery than potentially it is to process somebody under a possession with intent to supply. So again, in terms of having that capacity to be able to explore these offences is challenging for the system within the resources that they have.
It's not just about policing. Charities do great work supporting victims to rebuild their lives after exploitation. Joella from Action Homeless told us how they help people recover after cuckooing and protect themselves for the future.
So we have around 52 properties now across the city of Leicester, and they all have varying shapes and sizes, and they all offer different types of services. One of the ones we now offer is a 10-bed, they're 10-bed tenancies, and that's for people who have previously been cuckooed or who are at risk of cuckooing and also have that experience of rough sleeping. And it was really interesting when we started that property because we really spoke to the clients about what they need to feel safe, and some of the things that we probably wouldn't have done, they wanted. So, for example, they wanted overnight security, 7 days a week, overnight security, 9 p.m. till 9 a.m. So although they're tenancies and they can still technically have visitors, actually the security worker really helps them kind of separate and their tenancy remain that safe space. Some individuals stay away from their tenancy for a few days at a time, but it gives them that safety to come back, and that other person or that group can't come in or they can't kind of be accessed in that same way. So that really has created that barrier. Interestingly, they really like it when the security officer wears his high-vis vest and his door badge, and he really looks the part, which isn't, you would argue, very trauma-informed. However, it was the ask, it was that feeling of safety, just the visibility of the uniform, the people who were trying to come in with them, or their friendship groups actually automatically knew that they couldn't come into that building. Under Housing First, I mentioned previously that some of the people that we work with have kind of re-engaged with us after having properties cuckooed and taken over. And actually, instead of having to force the return to the property and into that environment, or essentially accept with them that it is rough sleeping, because of the diversity of our accommodation and my ability to play with that a little bit, we have been able to access kind of very temp beds to give a place of safety, to kind of start that conversation around what they truly need to keep safe, help people feed up a little bit, get warm their bones, access healthcare, and then we can start to talk about the longer term planning, regaining their tenancy. So that will be then working with the local housing officers. We've had some relative success with that, but without the flexibility of our accommodation stock, actually that response that they needed at that moment would have been really difficult to provide. So I'm really proud that we continue to do that here.
And what about young people? How can we protect them from being pulled into criminal exploitation?
I think firstly we need to look at prevention to stop more vulnerable children from coming into contact with criminal gangs and being open to exploitation. And that's why this report is important in looking at school as the locus of support and the role the education system has in providing early help and prevention from children being exploited. Secondly, we've got to remember that it's very difficult for children to understand criminal justice systems, to understand often what's happening to them if they are being exploited, and to understand the language that is being used around stuff that seems incredibly scary when they come into contact with professionals. That's why advocacy is particularly important for children who are being exploited. And it's why the ICTIG service, which is the Independent Child Trafficking Guardian Service, is incredibly important. They're a service that works with individual children who are being exploited to explain to them what's happening, to advocate for them, and to provide ongoing support. That's currently in 2/3 of the country, but we need it to be everywhere. And finally, I think it's really important when we're thinking about young people, looking at moments where there may be a drop-off in care and that young individual becomes open to exploitation. One example that's always stuck with me was meeting an incredible young girl who was in the care system, and her big brother had also been in care. On his 18th birthday, support dropped off almost overnight. And sadly, a criminal gang moved into his accommodation, took it over. He was cuckooed. They got him addicted to the drugs. And sadly, he passed away. I think that story and that girl's heartbreak from her big brother's experience of a criminal gang taking over his home shows just how important it is when there's moments where we know a child's turning 18 that they should continue to have support and care, but we also just need to look for moments of vulnerability and drop off in children's lives in general.
So, what needs to change to step up the response to criminal exploitation, to protect more children and vulnerable adults, and really target the organised crime groups behind it all? Our report, Criminal Exploitation, Modern Slavery by Another Name, makes 21 recommendations for legislative and policy changes to improve support to victims and go after the offenders responsible. The Anti-Slavery Commissioner already mentioned the need for education in schools and completing the rollout of specialist ICTIG support for exploited young people. We make recommendations for both of those in our report. In terms of changes to the law, the report repeats our long-standing call for cuckooing to be made a specific criminal offence.
Well, there are a number of things the government can do. I mentioned what we call cuckooing, which is the taking over of a property. We need to have a very standalone law for that. The police themselves know that it's very difficult to prosecute someone for the act of cuckooing, that is taking over an accommodation in which somebody else lives and using it for nefarious activities. Could be pop-up brothels, it could be drugs, all that sort of stuff takes place. That needs a specific crime because it's not really covered properly by the criminal justice system because there's different bits of it that break up. So right now I'm trying to move that, as it were, in Parliament to get a proper definition of this and as a specific crime.
For me, if someone has been exploited in their own home, we must find an offence that means the perpetrator is arrested and brought before a court. How will that harm ever end if we don't? What is the psychological effect on a person when they're being exploited when nothing is being done about it? Too often this doesn't happen and the victim is moved away instead. They're moved from their own homes, they're moved from their areas they've been brought up in. Why should they move? They've done nothing wrong, it should be the offender.
As well as an offence of cuckooing, our report also recommends amending the Modern Slavery Act to include a definition of criminal exploitation.
I think that would be incredibly helpful if we could amend the Modern Slavery Act to provide a definition of criminal exploitation. I think that's important for two reasons. One, I think by providing clarity on exactly what criminal exploitation is and the harm that it does to victims will help professionals who come into contact with victims and potential victims to provide the right support by identifying them correctly. And secondly, I think it's incredibly important because, as we've heard from law enforcement and those individuals who are working hard daily to tackle criminal gangs behind these horrendous acts, they want the clarity in primary legislation about just how damaging this form of modern slavery is, and for them to have the tools to go after criminals and hold them to account.
Other recommendations we've made are for priority to be given to neighbourhood policing and on making sure all frontline professionals, police officers, social workers, housing officers and so on, all have more training so they can identify victims better.
More training is necessary for frontline staff, response and neighbourhood police teams so they can recognise the crime in the first place. But more training is also needed for detectives so they can gather that evidence. That training must be refreshed as well on a regular basis as legislation and methods change.
Thousands of vulnerable people are being bullied and groomed to commit crime at the heart of our communities. Some progress is being made and charities are doing great work to support victims, but the response has to become more consistent and more effective. We can't allow criminals to get away with targeting vulnerable people in this way. This is modern slavery happening on our doorsteps.
If you'd like to hear more, subscribe to our channel for more interesting content like this, and follow us on Twitter @CSJ Think Tank for more updates.